What it do? This is the Brothers on Books podcast, where we find great books that will give you real value and actionable steps and have fun in the process. Please reach out to us at brothersonbooks@gmail.com for any book recommendations, or if you'd like to be a guest host for a particular book you have in mind. A great review or rating on whichever platform you're listening to this would be greatly appreciated. If you can think of any friend, family member, or coworker that might like this episode, please pass it along. For the original episodes, the OGs, please visit brothersonbooks.com. And we are proud to announce that we have partnered with Encha Matcha for your matcha needs. So use the link below for 20% off. I am Jack Alwile, and with me, as always, is my brother Alex Alwile. Al, how you doing today?
Doing pretty good, Jack. How are you?
Doing well. We're now represented by 3 different time zones on this call. So that's pretty
Yeah,
cool.
with us today we have special guest Daniel Magy, Dan for short. Dan, you're a pretty worldly guy. You studied at both UCLA and the London School of Economics. I believe you taught English in Korea. And I think probably most impressively, you've started, 2 or 3 companies now? Or more, 5. Wow, I missed a couple. So Dan, why don't you say hello?
Hey guys, thanks for having me. I have to disclose that we are related, right? So it's cool being on a podcast with my cousins. And I'm just excited to be here because like you guys, I love books and I love ideas and I love bettering myself every day. So hopefully we have some fun talking through the globalized system, and according to one person, it's imminent collapse.
So Dan, why don't you tell us
the book?
Yeah, okay. Go Al.
I was just going to say, so the book we're doing is this book by Peter Zeihan. I'm actually not entirely sure how you pronounce his last name. I heard him say it and I already forgot, but the book is The End of the World is Just the Beginning. It was, I would say, longer than what we normally do, but very interesting and pretty easy read. But Dan, so you actually chose this book. So how did you come across it and what made you interested in it?
I think I chose the book because it provides a data-driven contrarian view on how we've all been told to look at this like harmonious globalized system, right? And having lived in Asia, worked in China, lived and worked in the UK, and then back in the US, like there's a lot of stuff that really resonated with me when I picked it up for the first time. And I think when you mix in kind of like some geopolitics issues, like, where's China going to get its food? Or how are we going to get fertilizer for crops in Eastern Europe when all the fertilizer is made in Russia and we can't get fertilizer out of there? There's some really serious implications that we could be kind of, staring down the barrel of here shortly. So anytime someone is like pessimistically optimistic, I love to hear what they have to say because I think sometimes we're inclined to just be optimistic or pessimistic, but he's basically explaining how he thinks the world's going to kind of be reordered in the coming decades, and I found it fascinating.
Yeah, what were your thoughts
Jack,
after finishing?
Yeah, so my initial thoughts were this was kind of a combination of a couple other books we've read. I drew back to I can't even remember the name, the Katusa book. I think was it the
Rise of Tomorrow.
Rise of Tomorrow. Then both of the Tim Marshall books. I think we only did The Power of Geography, but also Prisoners of Geography as well. A lot of that. And then to a lesser extent, some of like the Rise of Civilization stuff that you get from like Sapiens and then Guns, Germs, and Steel. I sort of thought kind of tied like the main thesis from a lot of those types of books into one. Thought it was very interesting. He put a lot of the parts I found the most interesting were he's talking about like just the actual resources and like where they all source from, who's using them, who's producing them, and who needs them. And then some of the finance stuff is, I mean, always interesting. The currencies. I guess I'd be sort of interested on your take. I don't know if you've listened to him talk, but he vehemently hates Bitcoin, and I think he threw out a couple jabs of that in the book. It's much more apparent when he talks on podcasts. But yeah, those are my initial thoughts, I would say.
I
How
guess,
about yourself?
yeah, definitely notice some similarities between Power of Geography, Prisoners of Geography. I really found myself, I feel like my emotions go up and down with some of these books. Like with Nomad Capitalist, I found myself very like anti-America when I was reading that. And then this book, I'm very bullish on America again, and quite proud, to be American. And I thought he did a very good job explaining how we've kind of come to this place, this period that he says is unusual, transitory, where it's on cost and efficiency. And the new thing that people will be seeking out is security and simplicity, basically. And so I really enjoyed this book, and I'm very interested to talk to you about some of the science stuff, and then Dan about some of the supply chain things. Because there's a lot of complex moving pieces.
Yeah, some of the materials, he kind of likened his knowledge of some of the material science to the fact that he had a minor in chemistry. And I can say with a large confidence interval, you would not pick up that knowledge from getting a minor in chemistry. That would take a lot of reading in some material sciences, because a lot of what he was talking about, some of those heavy metals, like, you never talk about. No one would know what those heavy metals are doing unless you're doing some very in-depth reading on those metals, and you're very into like just worldwide manufacturing of use.
I actually thought that part of the book was going to bore me the most, and I found it the most fascinating, to be totally honest, where he kind of goes through like just key inputs we have in the manufacturing process and where it all comes from and how tied everything is together, right? Like, yeah, it's pulled out, it's refined here, it's processed here, and then it's assembled here. And it just shows you like how the safety of the seas has allowed this incredible system to thrive for the last 80 years. You know what I mean? And I think it obviously leads into his concerns, which are that system's going to crumble, both under like a Trump and Biden presidency, which is much more populist as far as manufacturing goes. And then obviously the rise of China, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot about that today. But yeah, that section of the book where he just kind of goes line by line was absolutely fascinating to me, because I don't think, one, we realize how resource intensive some of this stuff is, right? And two, just how like so many different countries touch pieces of our global supply chain, and how fragile it really is,
Yeah, I actually wrote something down on that from Ford. He actually said Ford taps over 60 countries, 1,300 direct suppliers. I mean, that's just mind-boggling to think about. That goes into your car.
Guys, we would, my medical brace company I own, we do our final assembly in China. Okay, we work with Velcro. Velcro's, obviously, you guys know what Velcro is, right? Velcro's in the Northeast. Okay, so they get the raw material from China. They do a process in the Northeast, and then they send it back to China for final assembly before it goes anywhere. So think about that. Like, one piece of product is just going back and forth twice before it's actually distributed. I mean, that's got to be, multiplied across tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of businesses, as far as like how that part of the supply chain, is just kind of global, right?
So I guess as I was reading that, like just what you just said, and then when they were actually talking about like silica, so like what is the benefit? I mean, obviously that must be cost effective, but why like constantly ship it across the ocean? Is there an argument for like having all the manufacturing of the piece in a single place, or is it just to try and almost like minimize risk in case something bad happens in one place where you then totally lose all manufacturing possibility? Like, what is, I guess, in your own business, like, what is the reason for that?
Well, so I think what China did really well for the last 30 plus years was kind of say, look, we have super cheap labor. All right, this is when it started, right? Super cheap labor. We'll basically use the massive amounts of people we have to kind of bring the cost processing little pieces of whatever we're building down so that you'll set up a factory here. And as you know, one or two of these popped up, then they became tens, dozens, hundreds, thousands. Like when you go to Northern China today, say you need to try 4 or 5 different pieces of material, all the factories know each other. And they have like this internal Uber system where you can call somebody in the morning and by noon have samples of 4 or 5 different products from 4 or 5 different factories in the Southern China area where a lot of which is really like the factory for the whole world. And so I think it's over decades of this building up. They've kind of just centralized the processing, the manufacturing. I mean, it could be a whole nother discussion, but like when you go there, like there are no pollution standards. So that's a big thing, right? So you can kind of pollute like crazy. Labor is cheap. I mean, Peter Zeihan goes into how now labor is expensive in China. And I mean, Southern China is incredibly rich. There's bullet trains, there's high rises, there's apartments, there's cars everywhere. It's not like what you would think, right? It really blew my mind the first time I was there. But the infrastructure to source and build has all been basically centralized there over the last 20, 30 years. And that's unwinding now. You know what I mean? Like I talk to people in the footwear industry, in electronics, everyone's trying to find their places for a variety of reasons to manufacture. But it's also like a lot of it is actually coming down to cost more than anything. It is more expensive now in China to build stuff than it used to be, right? They've kind of run out of places where they can go grab people to come work in these factories. And so China's actually doing a lot of automation now to try and stay relevant in a changing world. But I think that's why, being here in San Diego, the construction that's happening on both sides of the Tijuana border is insane, right? Like if you're not in Mexico, like you're late to the game is what we're seeing with a lot of big companies down here because they want access to the US market. They just want to have it at a fraction of a cost, and they could use NAFTA to kind of, put the infrastructure in place now to build stuff and then get it over the border. So I hope that's how I kind of answering your question, Al, in a little bit of a roundabout way, because it is kind of a complicated,
I just as a tangent, are you ever worried about your IP being stolen?
Oh,
because I feel like or do you even care? Like, I mean, I'm assuming you would care, obviously.
yeah. I mean, look, there's certain businesses I touch where we will not do anything in China. There's certain businesses I touch where we are working through our contingency to move manufacturing closer to the US. But the reality for certain things, right? Like we build a carbon fiber brace for people who've had strokes, right? That's one of my businesses. There's a dozen factories in the world that can do this, and 10 of the 12 are in Southern China. The factory we build our brace in, they make every carbon fiber Trek bicycle in the whole world. Okay, there's 10,000 employees. You've never seen anything like it. They make every Louisville Slugger that's carbon fiber in the world. They build golf shafts. So that's actually a Taiwanese company that's opened a factory in China, right? And then it just grew and grew and grew. There's some places you should be worried about IP, but if you're selling a medical product in particular, and I'm not thinking like something cheap on Amazon, like you're probably going to want to buy it from like a supplier that you know and trust. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
If they knock it off and sell it to their home market and it breaks and someone falls down, gets hurt, that's fine. But I don't know a lot of folks that are coming from Europe or the US or even India who are going and buying Chinese knockoff products, like, because especially in the healthcare industry, it's super, super, super important to get the right thing. That said, on the electronic side, like I'd be worried, right? Any sort of textile, I would be worried. I helped a buddy start a snowboard binding company, and like all that stuff is knocked off every quarter, right? Someone will do an innovation and all the factories are like on the same road. Every factory will do that same innovation 1 quarter later. You know what I mean? So like, yeah, I think that's a concern. I think what we should be more concerned about is maybe some of the more intellectual stuff, like what software they might be, ripping off, or do they, are they hitting American companies and trying to steal IP, that type of stuff, maybe more so than than like smaller products. But along that same vein, like I get why Tesla is like betting the farm on China, right? I mean, and they really are, like, but I'd be super concerned having a factory there, because there are multiple well-financed electric vehicle companies in China, right, that would probably love to get their hands on self-driving software if they don't already have it, right? Or maybe a manufacturing process that Tesla's perfected and patented that they could rip off. So for higher end stuff, I'd be a little bit more concerned, I guess, is my long-winded answer.
Yeah, sort of like, just as a sort of side anecdote from your buddy's snowboarding company, the paddle I actually used was actually developed in Montgomery, Alabama, and it was somewhat of an innovation. And pretty much 5 months after he went live, almost every other major paddle company was using the exact same stuff. So definitely happens.
Yeah.
And then, as another anecdote, I remember your aunt, our mother, asked me if she thought it was okay to take medicine out of India probably 5 or 6 years ago. And I told her I thought it was probably better just to take the American generic brand. But yeah, it was a lot cheaper, but who knows?
Totally.
So I guess you just mentioned Tesla. So I guess just you drive a Tesla, correct?
I do.
So what he also had some thoughts on Tesla. I guess I would be interested in, why did you buy a Tesla? Like, what are your thoughts on it, and what was your opinion on, I guess, his thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, for me, so I think I've drove a Prius for about 10 years. All right. And I drive a lot. So whatever gives me really high gas mileage, that's what I care about. I got hit by a drunk driver in the middle of the day, and my insurance check was pretty good. And so I just thought, look, I just put solar panels on my house because I live in Southern California and I have sun 320 out of 365 days a year. And I put enough to have 2 electric cars be powered, right, without it dipping into my energy bill. And I saw gas prices, like, honestly never coming down again, right? So I made that bet that, like, I live in an area where there's a lot of sun and I have solar panels that already power my house, so I might as well just not pay for gas anymore. That's why I bought that thing. I bought the cheapest version you can get, right?
So this was
But it's
this
great.
was purely a personal financial decision, more or less. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. If I could, because my thought was if I could cut like $100 to $200 a month out of my gas bill, like it just add up in the long term, right? And so that's why I bought the thing. And
what is gas?
I love the car.
What is gas, Southern California right now?
Let me look it up. Just 1 second.
Yeah, because you don't even do it, so you might.
Yeah.
What was gas in Charlotte when you left, Jack?
I think like 320.
I'm like 299 right now.
I'm trying to get you the exact price. I think there's a 7-Eleven 10-minute walk from me. Regular is 5, mid-grade's
Wow.
520, and premium's 540.
Wow. It's crazy. In Vienna, it's like 750 a gallon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and that's why they have smaller cars and smaller engines, right?
Yep.
So, yeah, I mean, so I think that, but like his whole point, I think, around Tesla is, I mean, yeah, he's got a lot of critiques for it, right? Like where they source their materials from, like does it actually make sense to have electric vehicles because the inputs are super high, and not everywhere has, you have to basically power them by coal. I think I'm probably in a lot of Southern California now is an outlier. I mean, here's kind of how I got to the solar panel thing, because I think that's part of his other story too about not thinking renewable. And he says renewables are a long way off, right? But like, I'm in a high sun area, right? And our energy prices have gone up 5 to 7% a year every year for the last 5 or 6 years. So in my brain, it was, if I could pay $120 a month, and just finance these panels over whatever it is, 10 or 15 years, in the summer when I'm running my AC, I'm not paying $400 a month. Like, the math just worked, right?
Sure, yeah.
And I overbuilt it thinking that we'd have multiple electric cars in the future. So that, like, because the energy prices were going up for our house, like, it kind of then led me to getting a Tesla, right?
Okay.
But I think his point is super well taken, is that there's not a one size fits all solution to everything unless we go with nuclear, right? And I think our generation is a lot more comfortable with nuclear than the other folks, because it's pretty freaking clean and safe at this point, right? But that said, like,
that was kind of my other point. He spends a lot of time talking about renewable energies, but essentially gives nuclear like a one-off sentence and then never mentions it again. And I feel like, at least in Katusa's book, he was making nuclear sound like the way of the future. And after listening to some TED Talks, which can be whatever they want, I kind of agreed with that more than the way of the renewable sources. Obviously, if you're in a high sun area like you are, or in a high wind area, those renewables work well.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, they're kind of not the greatest. I think he makes the comparison that Germany has spent like 6 times more than Southern California, but has gotten 20% of the energy output from the renewable sector.
I think the other part of it too is he just does, somebody will win, and we'll figure out a really, and Al, this is more your world, right? But
well,
if you could solve a way to make cheaper batteries that can hold energy, maybe you can actually like build these microgrids.
But
what do I know?
Do you have a battery source connected to your solar panels?
No, how it works?
Do you sell it to the city?
I'm grandfathered in. So the state utilities just came in and neutered this whole program, but I'm grandfathered in, and basically I'll get a like for like credit on my energy. So I produce like thousands of more, I think they're kilowatt hours, than I use a year. So I have this huge bank every year. And again, I told you, I overbuilt my solar needs thinking we'd have multiple electric cars, and then maybe we'd have like another rental unit in the back of our house, and it would just cover everything. The new program, because utilities here see the writing on the wall. You can go around our neighborhood in the last year, 80% of the houses now have solar. You only get like, I think 10% of the credits if you don't use it. So you kind of like have to use it during the day. It still makes it reasonably affordable when you think about this like continual 5 to 10% increase we've seen year on year with power prices. But the credits are not worth as much moving forward. And there's a mega lobbying effort done here over the last 2 years to basically gut this, the individual solar providers' ability to kind of bank those credits back to the utilities. They need to make money. They need to pay for lines that are up. There's running an energy grid's expensive, right? And when you start pulling people out of it, it becomes harder to kind of pull it off. So I think that's kind of what's happening.
I looked at putting solar panels on my Nashville house probably, it would have been right before, about like a year before I moved. And I remember, so they offered, the big thing was that they were going to provide a battery, because the credit that they were going to pay you out for was, I think, about 1/1000th of what the energy would cost. So essentially nothing. So what they were saying was, you essentially need to, during the day, charge the battery with the solar, and then use the battery to power your house at night.
Mhm.
At the time, well, for one, at the time I didn't have a lot of money, so, and two, I
Right.
just didn't think it also made sense for
Right.
me personally. But the batteries, I mean, yet again, this is not really where I spend most of my day, but what I remember reading about batteries, uh, and this would have been like 10 years ago, but the amount that you could, yes, this data must be out of date, but I remember the conversion rate was very low. It was maybe like 5 to 10% of
Mhm.
what you could actually store.
Mhm.
Uh, so whether or not that's feasible going forward, I have no idea. But that is a
I-
low
Yeah.
conversion.
Like I think there's certain areas where solar makes a ton of sense, right? If you're in Southern California and you have office buildings, like everything should be covered in solar panels because you're probably running the air conditioning and your computers during the day during sunlight hours, right?
Yeah,
And
that,
then
that
when you
makes a
go
lot of
home,
sense.
yeah, and
Right.
I think that incentive structure is there. What we're now locked into is like basically a self perpetuating system though here in California where it's sunny even in Northern California all the time, right? And the energy costs keep going up to maintain the grid. And so people are going to continue to pull themselves out of the system because they can do the math and they're like, okay, maybe it breaks even this year, but in 2 or 3 years with more increases, then I'm actually making money. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. And the other thing that's happened, which is very interesting, is you can do 100% financing on these things now, right? Um, I think what the banks realized is that it's a lot harder to like, you know, on your hierarchy of needs, if you don't have power at your house, right? You can't really live there, right? It's really hard to evict somebody if they don't pay their rent or if they're late on their mortgage, but the city will literally just turn your power off. And so that shift happened about a decade ago. And so now like there's a million companies out there that will finance solar because again, it's super high on your hierarchy of needs with our whole life. And so, there's great programs out there for 100 to 150 a month. You can basically own your whole system in 10 or 15 years, and the panels now last 30 to 50 years. You know what I mean? Like they last and work really well. They probably have an even longer shelf life than that. So yeah, I mean, so long story short, like I think we all agree, like the you know the renewable energy stuff needs to make sense and it needs to kind of be localized. There's not a one size fits all. Like I would have loved a longer conversation on nuclear as well. I mean, you can see the problem Germany has now, where after Fukushima they shut down their nuclear plants. I remember I was at LSE and the head of the environmental group who was in whoever what the head of their EPA, or I don't know what it is, under Merkel. He was like he presented at LSE and he was super excited to talk about how they're shutting down their last nuclear plant in a month or two. And now with the conflict in Ukraine and cheap gas not being available, I mean they're burning coal again. I
Oh,
mean it's
right.
like it's unbelievable, right? Like what a disaster.
It wasn't just coal; it was the
Bert,
dirtiest type of coal.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
and a bunch of them are chopping wood, I think.
Yeah,
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 which,
But
which is
but
all well.
Zeihan did have solar panels, right? Because he said he lives like outside of Denver. Is that is that right?
yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Okay.
he lives up in the Colorado mountains. So
Yeah.
look, it's like they're
Makes
cheap
sense.
and they can offset part of your cost, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
how you should think about this stuff. But again, not like a one size fits all. Let's talk, guys. I want to let me push the conversation for a minute. I thought the most eye opening part of this whole thing was the demographic crisis that no one seems to really talk about. That's coming for a lot of the developed world. It's coming for China, according to him. And like, yeah, you can see they've started to release data showing that they're in a decline, and those are their numbers. So like, what are the actual real numbers, right? Um, but then the numbers out of Europe were like terrifying. We went to a wedding in Italy last summer. We'd go to some of these smaller towns, like there's no one there. Like they're
Yeah.
just empty. They're gone. It's pretty crazy. Um, I don't know. What
Yeah,
did you guys think of the demographic piece?
yeah. I mean, it's kind of the spillover effect from that one child policy that they had, and now they have to live with that decision.
Well,
Go ahead, Al.
he also says it's that in tandem with the fact that they went to urbanization. So you're bringing people off the farm into cities. So like, because he was
Where they
just
naturally have less kids.
kids. Yeah, I think he said the average rate dropped from like in like a rural woman, it was like, I don't remember, like 5 or 6. When you're urban, it's like under 2. I don't know if those numbers are actually, they're close. I don't know if they're correct, but yeah, Jack, finish your thought. I cut you off.
I was just trying to see if I thought I had. Yeah, I think it was like 1.1 kids they're currently having, and they need like 2.1 to replace the population. It's by far the bleakest demographic on the planet. But yeah, I've heard. I think it's Richard Duncan. I don't know if you. I think he's on Kiyosaki's podcast a lot. I've heard him speak about demographics and yeah, how he uses it as a look into the future. Demographics drive everything. When do you spend money? When can you provide the most value to the population? And when do you invest the most? So those are all things that drive the backdrop of society. Yeah, definitely interesting. I will say, when I walk around Vienna, it just feels older. Like there's not as many young people. Charlotte to me seems like super vibrant. All these young people right out of school moving there, tons of transplants, and I mean I think he mentioned Austria too is going to have a demographic problem. Everyone's retiring in like 2020s and 2030s.
We see a lot of that even in the rural city area here in California. Like the farming, the Central Valley is being depopulated. Do you know what I mean? The young kids move to the cities to get jobs, and the old people are kind of just stuck there. And I mean, I think it's across kind of the world. You know what I mean? And we still seem to have a replenishment rate in the US, but because we haven't had these restrictive policies, but you know, there's definitely a thinning out in the rural urban, like the rural urban migration pattern is just global now. You know what I mean?
Yeah, Jack, I don't know if you would agree with this, but I feel like in our hometown, I feel like more or less everyone that went to college, like went away from our hometown for college. Because if you were staying in our hometown, you were going to like a very local community college, which is fine. Uh, but no one moved back. Like if you went away to college from our hometown, I don't really know anyone that then moved back to our hometown unless it was after you did some type of like professional school and became like a dentist or a doctor. Everyone that stayed more or less has continued, like all of my friends have continued to stay. And well, I shouldn't say my friends that didn't really go to college, they have stayed and they're more or less like they're still farmers. And there's
Yeah,
nothing, obviously being a farmer is very important, but it's just like, but the amount of people that are leaving vastly outnumbers the amount of people that are staying because there's really no opportunity there.
totally.
Yeah,
It
and and,
continues
and
to
they're
get more
talking
expensive.
they're talking about the the farming technology increases the yields of the acreage, so you can produce more food with less people. Um, and you need less people, and then what are those people that used to work on the farms doing? They have to move. Oh,
I'm a strategic advisor for a farming automation company. The co-founders spun out of the autonomous tractor at John Deere, and they're building autonomy kits for orchards, which is a huge business in California, right? We have orange trees, almonds, walnuts, all that stuff. And this is the data that we have been basically told. Um, you basically have a demographic bomb about to explode on farms in California, where none of the kids work there anymore. They've all moved away. Okay. It's all old people. And then 50 to 60% of the staff are illegal immigrants. Okay. And it's increasingly hard to get the folks you need to actually run a harvest on technical machines to get there. And if you think about, and this is now what they're starting to get concerned about, which is, bear with me, this is very Peter Zeihan. As they build factories in Mexico to offset the need for factories in China, the incentive structure for someone to run across the border, potentially die, and sneak their way to the farm fields anywhere in America. So it doesn't matter if it's California, Alabama, Montana, the incentive structure is going to die. And so more of these folks from Central America and Mexico, who normally would be augmenting our farm workforce, because these are dirty, dangerous jobs, right, is going to stay home and work in factories. So it's only going to exacerbate itself kind of as the world kind of deglobalizes. That is like what the farmers are telling me. There's less immigrants every year. Our native populations in these areas are getting older, and we're not replenishing with people wanting to work these jobs. They all move to the city. You know, guy on my soccer team's from Fresno. He's like, 90% of my friends have left Fresno. Fresno is a traditionally like mega farming area in California. Hundreds of thousands of people have lived there, but it's exactly what you guys are describing for Linwood, right? You know, if you went to any type of school, you're kind of gone.
So the automation on farms that you're looking at, is it kind of like what Zeihan was describing, like either like shaking trees or, you know, spraying pesticides, herbicides individually?
Yeah, these guys have basically built a camera powered system that you can integrate with any farm machine within 2 weeks, and then you can install it once you have the whole integration package in about an hour per machine. And it takes the human out of the loop. The first one's an automated tree shaker.
Wow.
It's really cool. And the traction they've gotten from the equipment manufacturers is massive. Like, you know, I can't really say until they announce it, but like they're very close to sewing up most of that market, because the manufacturers are getting pressure now from the farmers to say, you need to automate your machines because these are difficult machines to run. You know, we need you to solve this. And so all the manufacturers are now desperately looking for ways to automate their machinery, if that makes sense.
I mean, some of the machinery he was talking about sounded like almost science fiction-y, like, you know, the individual crop, like, you know, practice,
see and spray. And,
does the crop need more water? Like, does it need pesticide? Do you have any experience with that? Like that type of
the guys who started this business, that's like they were basically at a see and spray company that John Deere bought and then integrated into their autonomous tractor, and it would literally take pictures of the leaf as it was cruising through the field and be like, this needs pesticides or this doesn't need pesticide, right? And then it would make a decision. Where we're taking this new technology is first we automate all the machines, and then with these cameras, because they're super high definition 4K, and we have like a brain that sits right behind the camera, then we want to eventually get to a point where we can help farmers make better decisions on their trees, right? Because if you lose a tree, you lose 20 years of revenue. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so if you can identify, and that's actually an interesting job here in California, where these people make a lot of money, are these agronomists, right? The people who actually like will walk the fields or ride a golf cart and be like, we need to fix this, we need to fix this, but they're not training enough of them to really even replenish that side of it. Does that make sense? So,
I mean, that's a type of field that unless you're, you know, very specialized, you're not going to know it exists, or if you're like born into it, kind of.
Exactly. And that's the problem too, right? So as you have less people wanting to stay there, then you have like it's just like the demographic problem. You have less people who will naturally like revert to like focusing on farms. But I mean, the good thing in that book, you know, is that the US makes a lot of food.
Right.
So while
most food.
Yeah, most of the food. I mean, and that's going to be one of our competitive advantages, right?
And it sounded like with
Assuming,
the climate change, he actually brought up the comparison between, I think, the southern part of Australia and Illinois, and that the climate change was actually helping the crop yields in Illinois because they're almost at a point where they can do 2 cycles of plantings
Double.
or seedings. I don't know
yeah,
whatever you call it.
yeah. No, and guys, like, we should start our hedge fund and buy, the Brothers on Books general partnership. We should be buying like 10 acres of land in northern Michigan every year until we're old. We'll have great farming property.
Michigan will be the next like wine country, like all year.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Not just that little peninsula north of Traverse, right?
Oh.
Yeah.
Ale, did you get a kick out of I thought I don't know if Dan probably doesn't know this, but my 7th grade science fair project was testing different fertilizers on bonsai plants. So I thought I was like, when they were talking about the phosphate, nitrogen, and potassium. Ale, did you do that in your lab or not really?
Do I test fertilizers?
Well, do you like, have you ever mixed like, do you
Do I
know how
work with phosphates? Yeah, I work with
you did?
phosphates.
Okay.
Yeah, all the time. The thing I couldn't believe he left out when he was talking about fertilizer, the most historically, the fertilizer was you break nitrogen into ammonia, and that is what is usually used as fertilizer. And the chemical process to do that is the Haber-Bosch process, which was developed in the 1910 by, I believe his first name was Fritz Haber, who won the Nobel Prize for that.
Mm-hmm.
Who also he also developed the first chemical warfare using chlorine gas for Germany. So Sweden did not allow him to accept his Nobel Prize. Now, after that, just worthless piece of information. I know as of 2010, that process used about 1% of global energy to generate fertilizer. So I don't know if that is an up-to-date statistic, but as of 2010, that was
say that again. 1% of total energy it goes to the phosphate.
1%. It's not phosphate. It's ammonia. It's breaking nitrogen is very stable. Nitrogen gas makes up close to 80% of just our atmosphere. So you take it, and it's very, which is good because if most of our atmosphere was oxygen, when you would have a combustion engine, everything would explode. Oxygen is combustible, so you want an inert atmosphere. So you take this inert gas and then you break it into ammonia, which is what fertilizer is. Like that's what he's talking about poo. That's like what's in, poo that makes things grow. That's the nutrients. It's like usable nutrients, I guess.
I love when you go science on us, Al.
I found that. That's about all I had on that. I mean, I found that interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's from an agricultural perspective, that would be more or less what I would do. I don't really do that on a day-to-day basis because I don't work in agriculture. But yeah.
So Al, I mean, is a lot of that is like kind of what we read? Is that true? I mean, is a lot of it kind of centralized in Russia?
The farming or what?
No, the manufacturing of those.
That I don't know. A lot of those metals, would be that manufacturing would be centralized to Russia. A lot of the commodities he was talking about, I would guess.
Well, I had written down the phosphate suppliers are actually the U.S. is listed, Russia, China, and then Morocco was the odd one or the unexpected one, I guess.
So when he said the thing that confused me is when he was talking about some of the platinum heavy metals like rhodium, iridium, rhodium and iridium. He was saying those were in South Africa. And I always thought that the main supplier of those were Russia. I almost thought the exclusive supplier of those metals was in Russia. but he said Russia was second. So I would tend to believe what he was saying on those statistics.
Interesting. Interesting.
So do we
Would you
think
guys-
we think we're going to be seeing some pirates coming up? and I guess
You gotta,
yeah, go ahead,
yeah,
Dan.
go for it. No, you first.
Well, I was just going to say, so the whole premise of, I mean, I guess we've talked about some of the manufacturing moving locations. What else, I guess, have we seen that would suggest we are deglobalizing? Like, is like, I mean, well, what are the big things we've seen really that suggest that this premise is even true? Like, is the removing of troops from Afghanistan, is that part of it? That I guess, how do we?
So if you talk to
view?
people in the Navy, right, one of the things they'll say is they totally agree with him that we need like 700 or 800 destroyers to actually police like the brown waters, which is what they call the land right off of like, like continents, right? And instead we have just carrier groups, which are basically a way for us to show our power and like blow up countries and infrastructure. Do you know what I mean? So like we don't have the infrastructure built to stop things like pirates, right? Or to enforce this type of global system, because as soon as there's cracks in it, like we would need to kind of retool our whole Navy, and there's only like 3 people that build ships and 3 companies that build ships in the US, and they're like really slow, and they're not going to be able to make what we need. I almost wonder, like, if there was a conflict in Taiwan, and I'm not going to say that there's going to be or there's not going to be, like, the US probably sends like a couple carrier groups out there. They probably do a blockade of mainland China. China goes all out to try and block this, or to blow up this blockade. But I don't think it solves the problem for them, because they're so reliant on food and energy being shipped in. It's almost like a no-lose, a no-win situation for them, right? I don't know if we get to that point. And, I know Zeihan talks about this all the time now. He talks about the potential for a war in Taiwan and the Taiwanese Strait. But like, if you saw that happen, now the 300 million people that live in southern China that make all of our stuff, like, now we're not getting anything. You know what I mean? Like, take care of your Apple product, or your Dell PC, because probably not getting some chips for the next couple of years, if not longer.
Well, sort of to your blockade point, I think, I don't know if he said it in the book or if I heard him say it in a podcast, but he said, we blockade China at that point, and in 5 months, you have outright famine in China, and like in a year, it's like 500 million dead Chinese. So yeah.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
I guess to a previous point, when you're talking about the ships, like he sort of did another like one-off sentence on this, because when I was reading the protection of like the shipping vessels, my thought was, wouldn't it be easier to either one, like, they're obviously mercenaries, like, can't you hire like a band of mercenaries to patrol your ship, or 2, you build, defense capabilities onto the shipping, like the shipping containers? Like, wouldn't that make everything easier? Obviously, it would make it more expensive. Are we going into that type of route? Like, do you think that's going to happen?
Well, I think what we should look at is what happened off the coast of Somalia during the wild pirate days. We basically had to create a task force, like a multinational task force over there, to cover like thousands of nautical miles to try and protect that really like aggressively traversed. I don't know if that's right. Can you traverse on the water? Whatever. That area. I mean, that's what the Captain Phillips story is all about, right? Is like the Somali pirates got the boat, and the rest is history. But my guess is, if you were like Maersk, right, and you're this big shipping company, I would, you gotta assume that after the first one or two of these got snagged, they were putting folks with guns on these boats. You have to just assume that. So I think you're probably I think you're probably thinking the right way, Al. The just question is like, now are you fundamentally changing what would be a commercial vessel with all this military capability into something that is like not a commercial vessel, right? I mean, we'd have to kind of rethink how that operates. And I mean, he talked about that, right? Specifically South Korea, which is like incredibly prone to like a piracy disruption. He's like, why wouldn't they just put missiles on all their boats, right? To just blow up pirates as they came. So yeah, and maybe that's like a cruder way to, but so his whole point, right, is that like if one or two of these things fell apart, like the whole, like if one or two of these things got blown up or captured, like the whole system would fall apart. And maybe that's a little extreme, right? But if you don't have an ability to police high trafficked areas, I'm thinking like next to Iran or like the strait between like Indonesia and Singapore, right? Like some of these like areas where pirates have always lived, maybe even the Caribbean. But like, do you then actually have people who aren't willing to like, will insurance not underwrite shipping anymore? And if that happens, then the whole system falls apart, right? I don't know. Is that right, Jack, the actuary?
Yeah, that sounds pretty good rationale. Yeah, I mean, I liked how he went through the math of like how, as things have been more safe, these shipping containers have gotten bigger, the boats have gotten bigger. This lowers the price for all the products. But yeah, that could change in a deglobalized world. So I actually wrote it down. He let's see here. Like a unit of energy, if a ship is one, like moving something by rails is like 2 times, and then he had like a horse drawn to 20 times. So it just goes to show like how much more efficient it is to use water than other forms of transportation.
So I went through this like phase last year where I bought like 20 books that all talked about certain things that were really interesting to me. Okay. So one of them was shipping containers. One of them was chocolate, like the history of chocolate,
Okay.
the airline industry. And I can send you guys these. There's probably some good books in here that you guys would like. But the one called The Box, what you were just talking about, Jack, like as the world got safer, they over like 10 years normalized the size of the actual like box and then grew it from 20 feet to 40 feet. And then it talked about how all these deep water ports were built outside of traditional shipping areas. Like New York City has no shipping anymore, right? But just to the south of New Jersey, there's like a mega like deep water port where like a lot of the stuff for the East Coast gets unloaded. You know what I mean? But it's a really, really fascinating story how like a country like Singapore, you know what I mean? Like they built their whole economy just being that deep water drop off position for or the biggest deep water port in the whole world, and how that's affected now all of Southeast Asia, right? So like we would have to kind of, but this is over decades, right? So like if there was that type of disruption, we then have to kind of figure out like how do you retool the whole system, right? And maybe some stuff's globalized and some stuff isn't. And then if you have energy and food, I assuming all these things go wrong, having energy and food gives you a tremendous amount of power, right? And I think that's why he's obviously so bullish on the US, France, and Scandinavia, and what were some of the other countries? Turkey.
Turkey was one.
Yeah. I think he said
Argentina too.
The 3 countries that kind of tick the boxes for fertilizer, finance, and energy were France, Canada, and the US.
Yeah. The debt. What do you think about the debt conversation? Right. I thought that was pretty interesting. That like the demographic problem then creates this mega debt problem because we've been financing we're gonna have less people to finance the debt that we've racked up over the last 20 to 30 years.
Yeah,
I think it's going to become a problem.
I mean, yeah, I mean, do you think like countries are going to start like really battling for people? Like, I feel like they're not really battling for labor. That like, what am I trying to say? Like in America, taxes get high, people move to different states, zibby, there's movement. And we talked about this a little bit on Nomad Capitalists, where there are more people in America leaving or giving up their citizenship than like 10 years ago, which is still mind-boggling to me, but it's happening.
Same.
So like, I mean, I guess I'm thinking of China specifically. I mean, they have so many people, and Zeihan's writing, it's like they're going to just like sit there and take it and lay down and die, but it's not going to happen that way. So like, yeah, well, how do countries compete for people, and how, I don't know.
Have you guys been following what Canada's done over the last 5 to 10 years?
Not really.
So
in regards to what?
To people. So as we've thought about in this country, like with a limited number of, I think they're the H-1B visas, like the really highly qualified visas, right? Like from an engineering standpoint, or you have a unique skill. Canada's seen this opening and they've just like blown up their numbers of folks they're taking in. I think they're incredibly well positioned for an information age world, assuming we maintain that, with all of the folks they've been able to pull in who couldn't get it in the US. So a lot of US companies are now setting up subsidiaries up north, and or the startup scene there is incredible because you have all these really well-trained engineers, right, who want to work in the US, but they'll be just happy to be on that continent. It's created massive problems in Canada as far as like housing in their metropolitan areas. And I think they're about to get to 40 million. I was reading 40 million people in Canada. I'll search it while we're doing this. And it's actually like people are frustrated, if that makes sense, because they feel like the Canadian dream of like, getting a house and having a good job, like, is increasingly out of, and because the housing supply hasn't caught up with all the immigrants they're letting in. But like, for me personally, like, I mean, and all of us here, like less than 100 years ago, having our parents be, or what would that be, great grandparents be immigrants, like, I'm for it, man. Like, I would love to have people who are hungry and who want to, buy into the system that we have here and build businesses. I'd love to be that destination where it's safe. You can keep your capital here. You can build businesses here. I think that's how we should be thinking about this. I mean, the world is very globalized, but you saw that I think 2,500 millionaires moved to Dubai. I mean, what happens in a place like that when the energy runs out?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's crazy. I'd be saying we should be trying to take as many like highly educated folks as possible and assimilating them, just like all of us and all of our families were assimilated over the last 100 years, right?
So the Canadians are upset that just the cost of living of Canada has gone up because of the immigrants. Is that, am I understanding correctly?
That's what they're starting to draw the conclusion. I think their numbers, like, they'll take 500,000 a year. I'm trying to find the exact number because I don't want to like say something that's wrong.
And I think something similar happened in Portugal with that golden visa they were offering. The local housing prices started going up too much because they had so many expats moving there, and then the local citizens were, the houses are too expensive.
They basically rebelled. Yeah. And so then they limited it to like a couple areas that like needed to have population infill, right? I mean, there's a ton of Californians I know that either bought a second house, right? Or even did the whole like nomad thing, digital nomad thing that lived there. And they're like, yeah, if we could buy a house and not do the $500,000 golden visa, we'd live here full time. Yeah. So Canada let in 600,000 immigrants last year. Their population is like 38 million.
Wow.
So we're talking almost 2%.
That's a big increase. Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
And so like it's, yeah, sure, go for it.
I was going to say, I agree with the end point of your statement that, yeah, we should be looking to let in the most skilled people into the country. I think it only benefits the country. I think that's one of actually America's biggest advantages that he didn't really talk about, is that highly skilled, essentially, in many cases, the best and brightest from the rest of the world want to come here.
Exactly.
I don't know, Jack, if you would agree with that statement, but I think, at least in my perspective, that appears to be true.
Yeah.
Jack, when you talk to people in Europe, what kind of sense where do they want to live? They want to continue living in Austria? Do they want to like move to bigger cities in Europe? They want to go, like, what are you hearing?
It's very interesting. I have this discussion a lot with my wife Elena's friends. It's very unusual for them to move away. And I find this very interesting. Like they have access to all these cool places you could go study or could go live in, at least try something new. A lot of them do not move. There is one guy I'm thinking of in particular that did the nomad thing in Thailand during the winter. The thing with Austria is you're only allowed one citizenship. So to give up Austrian citizenship, you'd have to give it up if you wanted a different citizenship, but it's just the culture is a lot of, it just seems very, there's just not a lot of movement in Austria. Some of them go away to England to better their English for a year or two and then come back. I've heard some people do that. But a lot of them are pretty comfortable in Vienna and Austria and seem like they want to stay. But Ellen has also got some friends that haven't had the best luck with jobs, and I think in America you would just look for a different city, but it's just not even on their radar really. It's like Austria or nothing. So
is that
little
driven
different
by nationalism or just comfort, do you think?
I think it's a comfort thing here. That's my feeling. And most of them do have fairly comfy lives, so
Especially your wife.
Yeah. So
How do you guys think, if you look at the world in Zeihan's view, like how does Europe change in the next 10 years? Does it change in the next 10 years?
Well, he gave I heard him talk, and it sounded like he had a similar opinion of Russia that he kind of has of China, that Russia is essentially on its last legs and Russia is also dying. The rest of Europe, I don't really know. It's hard to, I find it very difficult to forecast out, I guess is all I would say.
Sure. Spoken like a true scientist.
It's just a cop-out way of saying I have no idea.
Yeah, exactly. I don't have any data to make my decision on, so I'm just going to cop out. Yeah.
Yeah, some of it's pretty sad though, because if the whole world operates together, everyone's able to specialize in things and everyone gets the latest and greatest. He's talking about the diversity of food in places like Poland and all these countries that seem kind of bland, but we could go to more bland days ahead. in some of these
Yeah.
countries, if these supply chains are really disrupted. But yeah,
Yeah,
I don't know.
that's a good point.
I mean, I kind of found myself liking France after. I mean, France really seems to beat to their own drum. They're like, we're gonna, keep, our citizens safe, make sure we're not relying on other people to defend us, or we're not relying on other people for our food or energy. I kind of like that mentality.
And they're really like trailblazing like a very different path too. If you guys watch the news and see what Macron's been saying to Xi and Putin, you know what I mean? Yesterday, he straight up called Putin, Russia, a vassal state of China,
Okay.
and the Russians went ballistic, right? Because there's a lot of pride, but he's basically like, look, we gave you a chance to play in this order we've built in Europe, right? You didn't want to do it, and he didn't really say this, but he's implying it. You're run in a really corrupt manner, and so if you're going to keep fighting this war, which you're not going to win, right? Because the French just gave another couple $1 billion of stuff. The UK, Germany, everyone just keeps arming the Ukrainians. Like the only place you're going to go to is China, and they're bigger and richer than you, and so you're going to become more and more dependent on them, right? You can't sell us your gas anymore. So what are you going to do? Build some pipelines to China? Yeah, probably. And then you'll just be a vassal state of theirs. It's pretty interesting, man. I mean, and it's a very different break from like what the European Union General is saying, what the U.S. is saying. So kudos to the French love to do it their own way, like you said, right? They beat to their own drum. So kudos to him for putting France first. So Jack's moving to France. That's just where we got on this one.
Maybe.
I was going to say, Dan, you asked that question. I guess what are your future thoughts on Europe?
Now that I'm on the spot, I mean, I think there's some places like that are just. I tend to like. I spent a bunch of time in Italy last summer. We had like a couple weddings there, which was pretty cool to go. And you cannot believe how cheap everything is there, right? Which means the local populations who are eating at these local restaurants, like they must be making very little money. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I'm talking like a third, a fourth, a fifth the cost of food in the US for like what you get quality wise. But man, so like you said, Jack, there's so many old people in these cities. It's crazy. And maybe it's because people want to live in a city, so they like young people don't have a chance to buy housing there. But it's almost like a lot of the places we went to last summer, Italy, Switzerland, UK, people are just getting old. And it's like, well, what do these countries look like in 20 years? You know what I mean? We'll need robots to take care of all the old people. Yeah, I mean, and look, like the system's very interesting. I think there's massive brain drain if you're creative and you want to go build businesses. The venture capital ecosystem is substantially better than it was a decade ago in Europe, but you're not going to get the big value in Europe that you get in the US. So a lot of them try and relocate to New York or California if they're doing tech stuff, which is the world I touch. I got a buddy from London. He's Portuguese. He's got a PhD. He's like, Portuguese PhDs make a couple $1,000s a month, and that's a good job in Portugal, right? Mm-hmm. And so, if money can move around like it can, you're going to have a lot of folks who are really upset because, say, people take an early retirement at 40 from the States and go buy a nice house in Portugal or Italy. I mean, that's a house that someone there can't buy. You know what I mean? And you're pushing up the property prices, and so I think there's a chance that there's like a lot of internal friction in Europe, and that could be either the member states not agreeing to work together, but it also could be just external forces. You know what I mean? Like where people don't feel like they have the same opportunity and they get upset. I think the whole world in general feels that it's going to be a scarier place for the next decade. I mean, you got belligerents in Russia, Iran, and China who are like clearly, you know, showing that they're on the war path in certain ways, right? So it'll be interesting to see. I would just assume for more, like a lack of stability. The fact that like the Europeans used all their supply of fertilizers this year, don't have and they had a mild winter, right? As far as Europe goes, like if they don't have fertilizer for next year, I mean, do you start having food problems in Europe? You know, I don't know. That'd be crazy. You know, imagine if you had some sort of like, and maybe I'm going extreme here, but some sort of rationing or the inability to just fill markets with basic, everyday crops, cucumbers, wheat, whatever, right? I would just, yeah. So again, maybe I'm being pessimistic, but like maybe I think Europe could be a little more unstable over the next 10 years.
Yeah. Well, should we
venture? Do you want to venture a guess?
Is that to me? I had the cop out. I mean, I guess I would say I have a feeling I could see from a financial standpoint, I could see Germany get tired of what it appears to be bailing out a lot of other European countries, and I could see that causing some serious friction. But I've spent a vast less amount of time than both of you in Europe, so I'd probably keep up to it much less than either of you. But that is I do think that is probably true.
Well, should we do closing thoughts?
Yeah, I have one last question before that, and you don't have to have this one in the interview. Does your wife want to raise kids in Europe or the U.S.?
Jack.
The biggest issue, I think, for a lot of the Europeans and kids is the number of mass shootings they see on the news. And it's definitely an issue.
For sure.
So I think Elena would prefer to have kids in Europe, but we'll see. I mean, regardless, we plan on spending significant time in both places. So,
yeah, I mean, we have Canadian friends who've moved back as soon as their kids are getting to school age for that reason, and we have friends that our kids are younger, and they're like, maybe we should go live in Europe. Mass shooting thing is like, people talk about it a lot now, especially as you think about kids.
Yeah, and in America, we may have become somewhat desensitized. I don't know if you saw in Belgrade a couple of days ago, I think there was 2 shootings, which is pretty unusual. I mean, and like all of Belgrade was flooded with people, like just blocking just protesting after 2 shootings. And I'd never seen anything like that in the US.
Yeah.
So
and they turned in a ton of guns, right? Like 13 or 14,000 firearms.
Yeah. So definitely, US is not without its faults, but it's still like it quite a bit. So,
Me too.
So yeah, you want to kick us off with closing thoughts?
Yeah, with that said, I think it's been a great episode. It was a good book. Please reach out to us at brothersonbooks@gmail.com for any book recommendations, or if you would like to be a guest host for a particular book you have in mind. A great review or rating on whichever platform you're listening to would be greatly appreciated. And lastly, if you can think of any friend, family member, or coworker that might like this episode, please pass it along. For the original episodes, the OGs, please visit brothersonbooks.com. I'm Alex Alwa. Jack, as always, it was a pleasure. Dan, also a pleasure. Dan, if you want to give like a little, a plug to yourself, I don't know if people can reach out and find out what you're doing about any of your businesses. Feel free to say that now.
Sure. Thanks for having me, guys. If you'd like to be in contact, Just find me on LinkedIn. That's the easiest way. I'm super responsive on that. Daniel Magy or Dan Magy. And it's a black and white picture because there is one other Daniel Magy in this world. And I believe he is a lawyer in Michigan. That is not me.
Okay.
But hey, if you guys would have me back for another book at some point, I'd love to join. This was a lot of fun. And keep doing what you guys are doing. It's great.
This was a good choice.
Great pick. Great pick.
Yeah.
And yeah, what are we reading next time?
I think we're doing the 4-hour work week, right?
We are. We have a super fan that called in and doesn't like the 4-hour work week. Yeah. And that's Miss Ashley Klein wanted to come on and debate this book. So I mean, I read that book like I think going on 10 years ago now. Yeah, I liked it the first time I read it. Miss Klein did not, and it should make for an entertaining discussion.
Have you guys seen his other book, The Tool of Titans? That's a really cool read too.
I picked it up at a Barnes and Noble. It's like 600 pages or something, right? It's like massive.
It's little snippets, like 3 or 4 pages of like all these really famous people, how they do their version of the Tim Ferriss like optimization of your life. It's pretty cool. From like Oprah to like David Beckham. Do you know what I mean? So definitely can't do it all in one sitting, but in bits and pieces, right?
Yeah. Maybe we'll have to check that one out too.
Well, enjoy your debate next week, guys. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks for being on, Dan.
Yeah, take care.